June 15th, the servant of God Orlando of Chiusi. Confessor, Third Order. On one of his missionary journeys through Italy in 1213, St. Francis came into the neighborhood of a castle belonging to a certain count. A great concourse of people was gathering for a festival, which the count was giving that day. Since the enemy of our salvation knows how to use such occasions to lead souls astray, the servant of God resolved to go there with his companions to warn the Christian people. When solemn Mass in the castle chapel was over, Francis ascended an elevated place in front of the chapel and gave an edifying address on the dangers of worldly pleasures. All the guests listened with attention, because the fame of his sanctity had already spread far and wide. In particular, one of the most prominent guests at the castle, Count Orlando Cattani of Chiusi, was very much affected by this address of the saint. He went to Francis and asked for an interview and for advice on leading a life that would be pleasing to God. Now, while St. Francis was zealous for the salvation of souls, he was also mindful of the requirements of good breeding. He told the Count that the present time was not opportune for such an interview, that he should not withdraw himself from the company of his friends to which he had been invited. At a more seasonable time, he would be glad to serve him for the advancement of his salvation. When, shortly afterwards, the saint visited Count Orlando in his gorgeous palace, he spoke to him so warmly about the dangers of a life spent in wealth and every comfort that Orlando resolved to arrange his life entirely according to the principles laid down by St. Francis. He also desired very much to have him and his brethren nearby, and proposed that the saint build a little convent on Mount La Verna, which belonged to him and at the foot of which his palace was situated. He placed the entire mountain at the disposal of St. Francis. Francis inspected the mount with his brethren and found the wooded recess with its many caves and ravines very suitable for a quiet life of prayer. He therefore gratefully accepted the offer of the Count. Orlando had a convent as well as a church built there at once. Later, many chapels were added. This place was chosen by God as the scene where the holy wounds were later impressed on St. Francis. In return, the pious donor, Orlando, desired nothing more than that St. Francis should receive him into the Third Order and become his spiritual director. Under this guidance, Count Orlando attained to complete detachment from temporal goods. Thenceforth he practiced works of charity towards his neighbor with great zeal, and distinguished himself in all the virtues of a Christian nobleman. After his happy death, he was laid to rest in the convent church on Mount La Verna. On the dangers of riches. How hard it is for them who trust in riches to enter into the kingdom of heaven. Mark 10:24. Thus says Christ, the eternal truth. And because riches keep so many people out of heaven, he says, quote, "Woe to you who are rich, for you have your consolation." End quote. Luke 6:24. By his example, too, he wished to show us the safest way to heaven. Therefore, he chose the carpenter Joseph for his foster father and shared his laborious life with him. There were then good reasons for it if St. Francis pointed out the dangers of riches to Count Orlando. Under the circumstances, what Christian would still crave to be rich? Consider that the dangers of riches are manifold. Temporal goods so easily enslave the heart and make the owner worldly minded. To that may be added the anxiety associated with preserving and securing riches, as if one were meant to live here on earth forever. Thus it was in the case of the rich man in the Gospel, who wondered anxiously what he should do with the fruits of his harvest. But God said to him, "You fool, this night will they require your soul of you." Luke 12:20. Then, too, riches are an occasion to lead a life of sensual pleasure, as did Dives, and he was buried in hell. Luke 16:22. Finally, man readily places all his trust in riches, becomes proud, and forgets the poverty and misery of his soul, for which he stands in great need of God's assistance. A rich man is apt to grow domineering towards his fellow men, despising the lowly, and forgetting the demands of Christian love and mercy. Riches mislead him, and at the end of his life he stands before the eternal judge with empty hands and a heart laden with guilt. Is there any reason, indeed, to envy the rich? Consider that a rich man can nevertheless be saved. Christ says, quote, "With men this is impossible, but with God all things are possible." End quote, Matthew 19:26. By the grace of God and Christian sentiments, the rich man too can enter heaven, yes, store up great treasures for himself there, as God's servant Orlando did. A rich man should not become elated over his temporal goods. He must consider them as a gift of God, given into his care, in order to do good and earn treasures for eternity. Thus, St. Paul writes to his disciple, Bishop Timothy, quote, "Charge the rich of this world not to be high-minded, nor to trust in the uncertainty of riches, but in the living God, to do good, to be rich in good works, to give easily, to communicate to others, to lay up in store for themselves a good foundation against the time to come." End quote, 1 Timothy 6:17-19. Prayer of the Church. Be favorable, O Lord, to our supplications. In receiving the prayers and offerings of thy people, turn the hearts of us all to thee, that being delivered from the greed of earthly pleasures, we may pass on to heavenly desires. Through Christ our Lord. Amen.